I'm getting old and sentimental. And it's hard for me to tell some of these things without tears flowing a little bit. Now, I need you guys smiling at me. Sober faces is going to make me really nervous. So, oh boy. I tell you, it's been quite a ride for the last 35 years. And I just praise God for what he's done. And if my voice quivers a little bit and you see me shaking a little, it's not because I'm really all that nervous. It's because I have a problem that I inherited from my mother's side of the family. It's called an inherited familial tension tremor. And as the older I've gotten, the worse it has gotten. Functioned fine up until about 10 years ago, and since then it's kind of gotten worse. But anyway, so if you see that, don't worry about it. I'm still surviving. Most of the food goes in my mouth. Once in a while I hit the nose, but, you know, we're getting along. So anyway, well, listen, I want to give God the glory, first of all. Amen. There is no way the Wings as Eagles ministry would ever have been born if God hadn't been in it from the very beginning. He's the one that led us, gave us the enabling grace. It's a miracle. If you knew everything that I know, you would say it could never have happened. But God did it. And it is an ongoing miracle today as far as I'm concerned. And I stand in awe at the way God provides. And the flight camp and how he started that, and how guys like you have come for the last 15 years and allowed us to have a part in your life and influence you for your future, and to see what God would have you do in your future. Another one I want to give credit to is my wife. I want you guys to listen to something. Amen. You better be careful who you pick for a wife. Right. You know, you hear the old saying, behind every good man is a good wife. But there is no way this ministry would exist today if it hadn't been for a loving, supportive wife. When we were going together, she made a statement. Of course, I think by that time she probably knew that we were probably going to be married. She said, "Where thou goest, I will go." And she meant it. I've drug her all over the country. It was a city girl that went from the city to another city in Denver, Colorado, and then to the farm, and then from there to a resort in Minnesota. She had a lot of things to learn, but she followed me and allowed me to be led of the Holy Spirit of God and just go where God led me. Now, I can't say there wasn't a little resistance once in a while. There was a little, but never much. Never much to the point where I felt like I had to abandon the direction that God was leading me. And so for that, I am eternally grateful. And some of you may know, we just celebrated our 60th wedding anniversary on the 8th of February. The big celebration came the 24th of May, when all of our children could be here, and many of our grandchildren. And so we're grateful for the years that God has given us. And we're still both in reasonably good health into our 80s now. And it's just been a blessed ride. So anyway, the Wings Ministry. I was raised on a farm in northern Minnesota, and my father was a pilot and a mechanic. This was back during World War II. We were on a 120 acre farm northwest of Minneapolis, about 120 miles. And my dad worked in Minneapolis at Robbinsdale Airport at that time as a mechanic, aircraft mechanic. And so he was only home on weekends. We didn't see him a lot back during World War II. It was a tough time. It was hard to make a living, and things were difficult. When come from a family of 9, 5 girls, 4 boys. My youngest sister was 6 months old at the time, and she came down with virus pneumonia. And we were snowed in the farm. We had a quarter-mile driveway, and it was snow up to your hips. And it wasn't shoveled out. We had no way of getting out. So my mother called my dad at Robbinsdale Airport there in the Minneapolis area and asked him to fly home with a J3 Cub on skis. He could land in one of our fields there, load Mom and the baby up, and fly into Staples, Minnesota, which is about 15 miles away, and take her to the hospital. Well, this is early one March morning. I was 7 years old. Dad was supposed to be on his way. The afternoon came, still wasn't there. And then the J3 Cub, even from Minneapolis, it was probably maybe an hour and a half flight, something like that, 2 hours at the very most. So back then we had phones that were on the wall, and you cranked the thing, and you said, Mabel, it was the operator that answered, would you ring the airport at Robbinsdale, Minneapolis? And gave a number, I guess, to, 4 longs and a short or something like that, whatever it was with the ring and crank. And so my mother called and wanted to know, has Royal Warinner left yet? And they said, oh, yes. He left early this morning. And we discovered that about 4 that afternoon, my dad's sister and a friend come walking up the driveway. And Dad had been killed in a mid-air collision. He had taken off, I think, at about 6 o'clock that morning, if I remember the time right. There was a young student pilot, about 21 years old, that was out there to practice that morning himself, both flying J3 Cubs. And this kid decided to have some fun with my dad. Now, you got to remember, my dad's on his way home to take care of his 6th daughter. And so for him to be fooling around is the last thing in the world he would have been doing. He had a concern for his family. He was heading home. This guy, from what we understand, took off, decided he was going to have a little fun, and caught up to my dad about 9 miles northwest of the airport. And for 2 J3 Cubs, he must have firewalled that thing to catch him, because they just, they're not that fast. It would have taken a little bit to do it. So he really had to put the coals to it. But he caught up to him and come up behind him, apparently dove underneath with the idea of coming up in front of him and scaring him. The only thing is, he pulled up a little too early. He caught my dad's right wingtip on his tail section, tore the wing out by the roots from its fuselage mounting area, and my dad spun in, killed him instantly, of course. My understanding is the wreckage was spread over a whole area of about 15 feet. He just went straight in. And this guy, of course, had tail damage, but he managed to make it back to the airport and survive. But he left my mother with 9 children. The oldest one, 15. The youngest one, 6 months. And still with virus pneumonia, needing to get to the hospital. And so from that point on, it was kind of a downhill ride financially and that sort of thing. Back then, life insurance was only available to those that had some resources, and so we were left quite destitute. And in the process of time, as the kids grew up, we pretty much all left home at a fairly young age so that we could take care of ourselves and survive. My older brother, Larry, was 14 years old at the time. I was 7. And Larry started to learn to fly at a pretty young age. He went to this little town in Staples where the hospital was, found a job at the airport there when he was about 15, and started flying at that time, learning to fly. And, of course, as I grew up, Larry had his ratings by that time, and so he began to teach me to fly when I was about 14 years old. He had moved from Staples, Minnesota, to a little town by the name of Nisswa, Minnesota, and a little airport over there, Haywood Gull Lake Airport in Nisswa, Minnesota. And he got me a job there. At 14 years old, gassing airplanes, mowing grass. The little airport had a golf driving range on it, and so I'd pick up the golf balls and that sort of thing. And they paid me $10 a week and an hour's flying time. And so that's how I started at 14 years old. At 15, Larry was teaching me, and at 15, I'd already had enough time to where I could solo, although illegally. The age for solo back then was also 16. But one morning, Larry took me on flying and thought I was doing a pretty good job. I had about 20 hours of dual at that time. And he landed, and he got out of the airplane and said, "Take it around 3 times." And so I did. I flew around and made 3 landings and takeoffs. And I just got the airplane parked, and our boss drove in. Had we been caught, I think we'd have both been in big trouble. But I didn't hurt anything. We survived and went on from there. And then I got my private pilot's license at age 17. I got my commercial at age 18. And at 19, I met my wife, who was working on my flight instructor's rating at that time. And we got married in February 8th, 1958. And I got my flight instructor's rating just a few days afterwards. And from there on, I flight instructed and for about a year and a half. And Larry, by that time, had gotten an airline job with, at that time, it was North Central Airlines. And North Central later became Republic, and then Republic merged with Northwest, and that's how that particular thing went. But of course, once I was instructing for a while, then the influence of Larry kind of encouraged me to take an airline job, or at least try. Well, at 18, before some of this took place, I was traveling back to Minneapolis where I was working, and on a Sunday night, and stopped at a church in Malacca, Minnesota, and went to the evening service, and the preaching took place. God spoke to my heart, and I realized that I needed what he was talking about that night. I needed to trust Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. And I was a little bit shy. There's an evangelical free church is what it was, and most of them, I don't think even today, give any kind of a personal invitation at the end of a service. And so I waited until everyone had left. And I walked up to the preacher and told him, I said, "I need to be saved." And he took me back into his office and took me through some scriptures. And I trusted Christ as my personal Savior that night back in November of 1956. Shortly thereafter, somebody must have given me a book entitled Jungle Pilot. And I believe that incident with the Auca Indians in Ecuador took place, I think, in 1954. But by 1956, apparently this book had already been written, was out, and I read that book, and God really spoke to my heart about missionary aviation. And but I had a lot of growing to do. I was very immature spiritually, had a lot of experience to gain, and I got sidetracked into the airline business then for the next 27 years. And it's kind of interesting how that took place. Larry told me that I understand that Frontier Airlines at Denver, Colorado is hiring. And this is after I'd been instructing for about a year and a half. I had about 1,250 hours total time, basically in J3 Cubs and Ronca Champs, that sort of thing. And I called Frontier Airlines to talk to the chief pilot. And he told him how much time I had and my experience. And he said, "Do you have any multi-engine time?" And I said, "No, I don't." And he said, "We require 500 hours of multi-engine time." So he said, "I don't think we're going to be able to help you at this time." And he said, "By the way," he said, "how old are you?" And I said, "I'm 21. And he said, "Well, maybe we can help you." And so they ended up sending me airline passes, and I flew to Denver for an interview, ended up being hired in June of 1959, and then flew for Frontier Airlines for the next 27 years. But God never let the idea of missionary aviation die in my heart. And it's interesting sometimes how he leads. We built a couple of houses out in Colorado, and we're doing pretty well. And then I got the wild idea. I felt like the Lord was surely in it and leading me to buy a small resort in Park Rapids, Minnesota, where we could have the family. By this time, some of our kids are in Bible college and grown. But, when you're a big shot airline pilot and making lots of money, you need a write-off for something. By this time, I was making about $100,000 a year, and I did need someplace to put the resources. And so we went back and looked at Park Rapids and found this little resort, and I thought, this would be a good deal. And we could have fun here. We'd have a boat. We love the water, love Minnesota. We're both from Minnesota. And we could write the thing off, and I didn't much care whether we had any customers or not. I just wanted to be able to write it off. And so we bought this place. And after buying it, a guy by the name of Dennis Deno came through. Dennis Deno was at that time just getting started in the Bearing Precious Seed ministry. And he came to present the work in the church that we were now going to, First Baptist Church of Park Rapids, Minnesota. And he presented the Bearing Precious Seed ministry work, and our pastor really grabbed a hold of that and got excited about it. And I think it was the next year, Dennis was back again, and I was commuting from Park Rapids now to Denver. Our whole intention was, once we bought that resort, was just to spend the summers there, run it from Memorial Day to Labor Day, close it, and go back to Colorado. But at the end of the first season, our redheaded daughter, particularly Sharon, didn't want to go back. She wanted to stay in Park Rapids and go to the Christian school there at First Baptist Church. Well, while I was gone, she kind of convinced her mother that would be the thing to do. And so I walk in the door that night after coming back off my trip, and it's time for us to start packing up and move back to Colorado. And so I'm approached, but Dad, we don't want to go back. We want to stay here. And Sharon can go to the Christian school here, and so on. And so I said, well, all right, we'll give that a try. Now, of course, that meant I was going to be commuting full time. And what I would do is I'd fly a beach bonanza that I had at that particular time, and I'd fly that from Park Rapids to Fargo, North Dakota, where Frontier operated in and out of. I would leave it parked there and then jump on Frontier, go to Denver, and maybe stay overnight if I needed to catch my trip the next day, fly for 2 or 3 days, and do that in reverse, going back home. And I always said that anybody that commuted had to be crazy. And I discovered that that's true. You got to be nuts to commute, because there's a lot of lost time, But it was, we felt like at the time it was the thing to do. And so we did. And then I believe it was the next summer, back in the summer of 1984. In fact, I think in the spring of 84, Bob Adams had, Dennis Steno had put me in touch with Bob Adams. He had a ministry called Wings, Bearing Precious Seed. And his main ministry was hauling scriptures into Mexico, Central America. And in fact, it was one evening I came home and Dennis Steno was in our office and had Bob Adams on the phone. And I walked in and he said, "Hey, I got a guy here that wants to talk to you." And so he put me on the phone with Bob Adams. And we visited for a little while, and Bob Adams asked me if I would take a mission trip with him. And so we arranged to do that. And I think it was in April of 1984, I took our pastor, Pastor Warren Klink, and our son Gary, and flew to Halls, Tennessee, to pick up this trip with Bob Adams. And that particular day, as we approached Halls, Tennessee, it was solid overcast. And Halls is a small airport with no approach facilities. And so they were on the ground praying that God would open a hole for us so that we could get down through and land. And I guess I must have had some alternate plan of some kind. I don't remember what it was at the time. But as we passed over Halls, Tennessee Airport, I looked down and there's the airport. There was a hole. It cleared out enough. So we let down through and landed. And then from there we met a guy by the name of Bill Horner. Bill Horner was a retired military fighter pilot, flew many missions in Vietnam. And Bill was a Christian guy and was doing some flying for Bob Adams. He had a Cessna 206. We met Brother Bill, Bob Adams, and we loaded up that Cessna 206 that night with 400 pounds of scriptures. The next day, myself and Pastor Klink and Bill Horner took off. We had to leave Gary back with Bob Adams, working the Bearing Precious Seed ministry with Bob there for a few days. And so the next morning, it was ground fog. It was almost 0-0. We get in that 206, and Brother Bill takes off, and probably at about 100 or 200 feet, we're on top. Beautiful, clear day. And on our way to Veracruz, Mexico. And as we get down to Veracruz, working with missionary Don Rogers took us to a village up in the mountains the next day, about, I think it's probably 150 miles northwest of Veracruz, and to a Totonacan Indian village. And in order to get to the village, we had to park down below the mountain. It was about an hour and a half walk up the mountain to get to the village. But when we arrived at the base, we were met by a national preacher. And this Mexican preacher got to talking to Don and told him, he said, "We've been praying about scriptures." He said, "We had no idea where they were going to come from," but he said, we need Bibles. And we had 400 pounds of scriptures with us to be able to give him. And it reminds me of a verse in Isaiah 65:24. And it says, "And it shall come to pass that before they call, I will answer. And while they're yet speaking, I will hear." And that was, what a testimony that was to me. And to Pastor Klink as well. And so we spent that time, walked up the mountain into the Totonacan Indian village, and had a blessed time with those guys. And then back down to Veracruz and loaded up in Bill Horner's 206 and headed back for Halls, Tennessee. Unfortunately, I'd gotten a hold of some bad water. And I got so sick I was hoping I'd die. And arrived in McAllen, Texas, to clear customs on the U.S. side. And, well, I want to tell you, I was flowing from both ends. Didn't make a mess in the airplane, praise the Lord, but I was one sick guy. And we took off from there then and went on to Halls, Tennessee, and joined up with Bob and Adams and our son Gary again. And Bob got me some buttermilk. How many of you guys like buttermilk? Man, I can't believe it. What a bunch of sissies. Wow. Did you raise your hand?
I don't like it.
Yeah, you're one of the only men in here. Praise the Lord. Well, anyway, I like buttermilk. So he gave me that buttermilk, and it did help me. But the next morning, I was feeling better. We took off and flew back to Park Rapids. Then later that summer, we had a Bearing Precious Seed conference. And men like Don Fraser, who is considered the father of the Bearing Precious Seed ministry, Carlos Demarest, who took many a bus trip down into Mexico, Dennis Deno, involved in the Bearing Precious Seed ministry, Bill Horner, one of the, flying some of the mission trips, and a couple others. And it turned out to be just a tremendous time. We closed the resort so that these people could stay at our place. And so we had the cabins, we had 9 cabins, they were all full with people that were there for the Bearing Precious Seed conference. Don Fraser is one of those guys that never quit teaching. And so we were talking and visiting, and we got to bed probably 1, 2 o'clock this particular morning. But before he went to bed, he said, "Bob, would you wake me up about 6 o'clock, knock at my door?" I said, "Sure." So I did, got up and knocked at his door. And he said, "Would you come on in for a minute?" So I walked in, and he said, "Have a seat." And so I sat down, and he said, "I want you to look at something." He said, "Do you see the curtains that you have in the windows there?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Do you see anything wrong with the eagle that's on that curtain?" I said, I had no idea what he's talking about. I said, "Well, not really." And he said, "That eagle only has one wing." He said, "Would you be that other wing?" That invitation changed my life. First of all, my trip to Mexico had just torn my heart and Pastor Klink's apart. I mean, God really used it to move in our hearts. And then with Don Fraser making that invitation, or giving that invitation, I told him, I said, "Well, I'll certainly pray about it." And so I did. I prayed and sought God's direction, and late that summer, we were sitting around our dining room table with a couple of our children and said, if we start a ministry, what would we name it? We began to search the scriptures and came to Isaiah 40:31. "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint." You see that scripture verse on our hangar floor. And I thought, wings as eagles, boy, that'd be a great name for a ministry. And so we adopted that name and began to make some plans. And in January of 1985, we had our first meeting. Before that time, Don Fraser, of course, spent some time with me and gave me what he said were tools of just teaching. And I had never done much preaching before, a little bit in nursing home, teaching a little Sunday school, and that sort of thing. But for the most part, I was not a public speaker and not used to doing that sort of thing. And so it was kind of difficult for me in the beginning. But anyway, in January of 1985, a pastor about 20 miles east of Park Rapids in a small church, White Oak Baptist Church, allowed me to come in and present the Wings as Eagles ministry. And that church took us on for $15 a month. And that was the beginning of Wings as Eagles.
What happened to Frontier?
Frontier, oh yes, that was a little later though. Yeah, Frontier Airlines 2 years later filed bankruptcy. And at that point, we had been in the ministry about 2 years. And when it filed bankruptcy, I really felt like that the Lord was telling me it was time to get out of the airline industry and go into the ministry full time. So for 2 years, I was flying Frontier Airlines. We were running the resort and flying mission trips for Wings as Eagles for those 2 years. Pretty busy guy for a while. But boy, what a blessing it was. And so anyway, when that happened, I was sent a telegram, and I was supposed to report to Houston, Texas, to go to work for Continental Airlines. Continental had negotiated some contracts apparently with the Frontier and took their airplanes and that sort of thing in the cruise. And so I was supposed to report to Houston, but I really felt at that point that God was leading me out of the airline ministry, or out of the airline industry, into the ministry of Wings as Eagles. While we were still in Park Rapids, I used to, in the wintertime, the church was heated by wood, and we had a Christian school, wood furnace, and I used to go down early in the morning before the school started and crank up that furnace to get things heated up for the young people when they would come to school. And the ministry had been going for about 2 years, and I'd flown several mission trips. And this particular morning, I just kind of felt down, felt like I just had to have some help if this ministry was going to continue to flourish and function. And they had a little nursery there in the back of the church, and I used to go back to that nursery and spend time praying and talking to the Lord. And this particular morning, I went back to the nursery and I asked the Lord, I said, Lord, would you mind if I just sat down this morning and talked to you for a while and share my heart? And I asked him, I said, Father, we need somebody to come alongside that could present the work in the churches and put trips together. Let me do the flying and that part of it and so on and so forth. And after I was through, I went home. And my wife said, there's a preacher that called you by the name of Doug Calap, and he'd like to have you call him back. And so I called him and talked to him for a little bit. He had been in Pensacola, Florida, Pensacola Christian School, and they had sent tickets out apparently to several pastors to bring them in to introduce the school to them. And while he was there, he ended up being placed in a hotel room with another preacher that I had been with Dennis Steno about a month before. And Doug had been on a mission trip to Mexico about a month or two before, and he had his leg kicked by a horse in the knee. So he was limping around and on crutches, and this preacher asked him, he said, what happened to you? And he said, I was on a mission trip to Mexico and got kicked by a horse. And then he explained to him how he wanted to start an aviation ministry. And he had already picked a name. It was Eagle's Wings. It was what he had picked. He had had some stationery printed up and the whole business apparently, but he was learning to fly, but had just soloed. So he had no background, no experience as far as aviation was concerned. And so I talked to him, visited him for about 30 or 40 minutes, and discovered that his vision was pretty much the same as mine, except I was already doing what he wanted to do. And so we arranged to pick him up and go on a trip within another month or two. I forget exactly how long it was. And I picked him up and another preacher in this bonanza that I had. We flew down into Mexico and was there for about a week. And when we came back, probably I think a month later, something like that, Doug Calap resigned his church and came with Wings as Eagles full time. And you know, when God is in something, he moves. He gives you that enabling grace. He answers your prayers. He meets your needs. And I just stand in awe how God has worked and blessed and honored. And we're just grateful for what he's done. So anyway, then we were in Park Rapids for probably another couple of years, and we ended up moving the ministry back to Woodside Baptist Church in Aurora, Colorado, We had our son Gary was living out there at the time, and had I guess Lisa was there, another daughter of ours. And so we ended up moving back to Park Rapids. But with Doug Caleb on board now, most of his contacts were in this part of the country, east and south. And so I was deadheading the airplane from Denver to the churches that he was putting trips together at back east. Well, it's pretty expensive to deadhead an airplane like any kind of an airplane. And so we were using the Bonanza for a little bit, and then we traded that for an Aztec. And so I began to pray, God, we need to be able to move this ministry back east someplace. And I wasn't sure where. There were a couple of invitations that we had gotten, but I didn't have peace about it. And so one day, I had been praying for about a year, and one day I was out mowing the lawn in the spring of 1996. And wanted to come out and had a phone call from Pastor Randall King. Now, I had met Pastor King. We had taken a trip over here about 4 years before and visited with him for a little bit. But to be honest with you, I'd forgotten about it. It took me a while to figure out who I was talking to. But we visited for a little bit, and he said, "What's this I hear about you wanting to move the ministry back east?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I have been praying about that." And he said, "Well, let me tell you a little something about Wildwood Baptist Church. Some of the stipulation that had been in my prayer, I want it to be a church of between 400 and 500 people or so, at least large enough and debt-free, where if we needed some financial help, they could help us." And he said, "We're running about 400 to 500 membership." And he said, "We just built a print shop, which is this." He said, "We're totally debt-free." And he said, "We would be honored if you would consider moving the Wings of Eagles ministry back to Oshkosh." And so I said, "Well, I'll certainly pray about it." And, we talked and hung up. I went back out to continue mowing the lawn. And then I got to thinking, Lord, he just answered every request that I've had. What more is there to pray about? And so I said, if this is what you have in mind for us, we'll do it. And Juanita and I were headed for Prince Albert, Canada, within the next couple of weeks. I was supposed to sing at a wedding up there with some friends of ours. And so I said, okay, what we'll do is I'll just do a little touch-up painting. I'm not going to do a lot of work around here. We'll just touch up a little bit. And we'll list the house and head for Canada. And that's exactly what we did. And while we were in Canada, just for those few days, I got a call from our realtor and said the house is sold. And so we went from there to here. And we looked at about 40 houses in 3 days. And by the time we got through looking at those, I was so confused I had no idea what to do. Well, the couple the realtors were in the church here. And so I was visiting the night before we were going to head back for Denver. And they said, I tell you what did you think of that house in Amro? That was the first house that was shown to us. It was brand new. They had just built it. And I said, well, we kind of liked it, to be honest with you. And he said, if you'll buy that house, he said, we'll knock off $5,000. And I said, if you'll do that, we'll take it. So we bought it. Signed a contract on it, headed back for Denver. We closed on the house in Denver on the 22nd of July, 1996. One of the members of the church here at that time was on a business trip in Denver. And Pastor King, or somebody must have told me about it. So I got a hold of Jeff Prowitz, is his name, and told him we were getting ready to move back to Oshkosh and wanted to know, could you drive a vehicle for us, give us a hand? And he said, yeah, I sure will. So he came over, helped us pack, drove one of the vehicles. We rented a U-Haul truck and got back here and closed on the house in Amro on the 26th of July, just 4 days later. And I'm just saying, when God is in things, things come together quickly and in a right way. And so as you young men look forward to whatever God has for you in the days ahead. Trust him. You know, some verses that have become some of my favorite verses is in Proverbs 3:5-8. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Be not wise in thine own eyes. Fear the Lord, and depart from evil. It shall be health to thy navel, and marrow to thy bones. And those verses have proven so true. Get out of yourselves. Give yourself to the Lord. Trust him, and he will lead you and guide you and direct you. Another kind of interesting thing, you know, when we bought that resort in Park Rapids, Minnesota, that was in the flesh. I tried to convince myself that was God's will, but for the most part, it was what I wanted. But see, God used what I wanted to direct our lives and to cross our paths with some men that could influence us for the glory of God and change our lives for eternity. Sometimes he even takes what we think is his will. And actually, I think it turns out it was his will. But I didn't know it at the time. It was more my will than his. And even though I was wanting to give him credit for it. But God will direct you. He'll guide you. Another thing that comes to my mind is God says that he will be a father to the fatherless and a husband to the widow. Probably the only reason I'm not in jail today is because God became a father to the fatherless. He watched over me as a young boy when I was growing up and kept me out of trouble and kept me from doing things that I otherwise could very well have done. I didn't have the guidance of a father. I grew up without a father, and we were pretty much scattered at a pretty young age. Somebody had to be my father, and it was God himself. And then I had an uncle that was a preacher, and he took an interest in me, and I know that God answered his prayers on my behalf. And I stand before you today only by the grace of God, his wonderful mercy. Shortly after we moved here, the thought of the flight camp came to mind. There was a fellow by the name of Fred Swanson, and he was working for Basler Aviation at the time, and flight instructor, pretty sharp guy. And I got to talking to him about it and asked if he would help me start a flight camp for young guys like you. And I thought, you know, in Christian schools, as a rule, they take a senior trip with the juniors and seniors and go around to different colleges and try to expose you to Christian colleges so that you can pray intelligently and try to make a wise decision as to where you ought to continue your education. And I thought, you know, wouldn't it be a blessing if we could, particularly guys that are interested in aviation, if we could have something like that, bring them into this kind of a thing and expose them to aviation and missions for a week, and so that they could go home and pray intelligently about what God would have in their future and make wise decisions with knowledge. And so that was one of the big motivating factors that caused me to start the flight camp. Well, unfortunately, Fred Swanson that summer, before we had a chance to really make many plans for the flight camp, was killed in an airplane crash on final approach right out here at Whitman Field. And so that kind of took care of the flight camp for that year. But the next year, this spring, I think sometime, I met a missionary by the name of Dave Spangler. And he was at a missions conference up in Appleton. And I visited with him for a little while and found out he had a Cessna 172. And he was a flight instructor. And I said, you know, I'm wanting to start a flight camp for young men ages 14 to 20. And the only reason I picked that age, because I started flying at 14, I figured if I can do it, any kid at 14 can. And I figured probably I ought to have a cutoff at 20 someplace. And so, anyway, he consented to do so. Bring his 172 up here from, where was he, in Florida or Georgia or someplace? Yeah. And so he brought that up. And we ended up having 9 campers that year and had a fantastic camp. Gene, of course, Zestera got on board with us, and frankly, without Gene, it would be much harder for us to run the camp that we run. So we praise God for Gene and for what he does. And so anyway, that was the beginning of the flight camp. What was that, back in 2002 or something? 3? Yeah. And God has just blessed it and honored it, and we are so glad you guys are here. We look forward to having the privilege and opportunity to invest in your lives and to have an influence upon you. And we're going to be excited to see what God does with you in the days ahead. It's been interesting to get reports back from some of the campers that have been with us in the past and how God is using them today and what he's doing in their lives. And so thank you for coming. Thank you for being a part. Now, when you go home, tell others. Advertise it a little bit, and we'll see what God will do in the years ahead. So God bless you. Might you have a blessed finish to your camp, and we look forward to hearing what the Lord does in your lives. Are there any questions?
Whatever happened to that 172 that we used that first year of flight camp?
You know, what did we do with that thing? I think it got painted and refurbished and reupholstered, and it's the one you're flying today. What a blessing. And I can't praise God enough for a guy by the name of Terry Rushing that came with us. The ministry of Wings as Eagles would be dead today if it were left to me. So Terry and his dear wife, Sarah, have adopted this work as their own, and he just tells me to shut up and get out of the way. Now, I don't like it when he tells me that, but I try to shut up and get out of the way. So thank you, Terry, for all that you do. For Bart. And, oh, there's another one. Yeah, Bart, we took him on how many, 11 or 12 trips? 11 mission trips, many of them into Mexico. And were you ever in Central America?
No, with the Dominican and Canada.
Right, yeah. And finally, the Lord spoke to his heart, and he resigned his church up in the Upper Peninsula and joined the Wings as Eagles ministry. And it's been, 18 years now?
18 years.
Wow. Just praise God for the men that he's brought along. Now, of course, we have Sam Coleman that has seen fit, the Lord led him to join us, and Jack Hunt, who got involved with us about the same time Dave did, or a year or two after? Second year. Yeah. And has been at the camp every year since then. So it's just amazing to me. I stand in awe at the way God has brought men to work with us and to see this ministry continue to grow and prosper and bring glory to his blessed name. Any other questions? Man, I must have done good.
You rehearsed the story of the fella in Monterrey, Mexico that you were with that encouraged you.
Oh, yeah. I had taken a mission trip. By this time, we had purchased the Aztec. We actually traded the Debonair for the Aztec, or the Bonanza. The Debonair, if you don't know the difference, a Bonanza has a V-tail. The Debonair is the first straight tail Bonanza. So it's a tail section difference, basically. And but anyway, we had the Aztec, and I'd taken a mission trip out of Woodside Baptist Church in Aurora, Colorado, gone to Monterrey, Mexico. And we had a contractor on board. Paul Davis was his name. And we had been working on a church down there in Monterrey. And on a Monday evening, we were sitting after dinner and just kind of visiting. And I just had to confess, I've wanted to quit this ministry 1,000 times, but the Lord just would not let me, and frankly, my wife wouldn't let me. Every time I started talking that way or not taking a trip, and she said, "You're just letting the devil have his way." So anyway, she kept pushing me. I think she just wanted me out of the house, but anyway, we kept going. We kept going. And Paul Davis, as we were talking, he reached over and patted me on the back, and he said, "Bob, thanks for not quitting." He said, "Had you quit, we wouldn't be here tonight." And boy, that was an encouragement to me. One other time, I was in a missions conference over in Lansing, Michigan. And I presented the work, and I had a young boy come up to me and hand me an envelope. And it had a nickel in it. Amen. And he said, "I want you to have this for your ministry." Amen. Those things, you guys, you have no idea. Right. When you're starting a ministry, these little things that God does to encourage your heart and to help you to understand and believe in your heart that what you're doing is what he wants you to do. And so you just keep on keeping on. And 33 years later, here we are. And we just, can't praise God enough. Any others?
Can you tell the story of your first time to Papua New Guinea?
Papua New Guinea. Yeah, I think we had started the ministry by that time, and I had heard about a missionary there by the name of Lewis Young that was pretty much marooned in a small village, and the only way out was about a 7 or 8 hour walk through the mountains to the nearest airfield to get help through new tribes or something like that with a helicopter. I heard about this, and we had just inherited a 57 Chevrolet. And I decided to sell that Chevrolet and take the money. We got $2,500 for it. Take the money and give it to that missionary to build a runway with. So we sent that money to him, and he spent the next year with the natives with wheelbarrows, picks, and shovels, and dug out of the side of the mountain about 20 feet deep in one area a runway to be able to serve the village where he was serving as a missionary. And as the runway was finished but had not been licensed yet, approved. Anyway, there was a pastor in Superior, Wisconsin. I can't think of his name. Rick Scarberry. Pastor Rick Scarberry. I had presented the work in his church by this time, and he had a missionary friend of his that he'd gone to school with by the name of Jim Bloom. And Jim Bloom was a missionary pilot in Papua New Guinea. And so I was still able to get airline passes through Continental Airlines, even though I was no longer flying with them. When I left, I ended up being able to get passes for the next 20 years. And so I got airline passes on Continental, and Rick Scarberry and I flew to from Minneapolis to San Francisco to Honolulu, and then from Honolulu to Guam. And we got stuck in Guam for a couple of days. And boy, there's one of the greatest answers, I'm not sure the word to use, but it was an answer to prayer in Guam that just has always struck me. We had to relax. There was only 3 flights a week, I think, out of Guam to Port Moresby, New Guinea. And so we were stuck there for a couple of days. We were staying in this hotel, and we went out swimming in the bay area. It was real shallow. You could walk out a half a mile, and it was still only up to your waist or something like that. So we were fooling around in the water, got back to our hotel room. Rick was supposed to have the key, but he didn't have it. Oh, no, he said, I had it in my pocket. He said, I must have lost it out there in the bay. And we found out it was going to cost us $50 if we didn't return that key. So we had a little prayer meeting and walked back out into the bay, and he walked right to it. I thought, we're never going to find that key. But he did. He walked right back to it. It was silver, and the sun was kind of shining on it, and and kind of reflected a little bit, picked it up, and we had our key back. Well, then we flew on to Port Moresby, and Jim Bloom picked us up with a Cessna 185 that he still owns, and flew us up to Wow, New Guinea. And we spent about 2 weeks with him there. And in that process, of course, Jim flew us around a little bit, and we had the opportunity to go fly over that airstrip that we had had apart and seeing constructed. We weren't able to land because it had not yet been approved, but we flew over it low and was able to look at it, and I believe the Youngs were down there waving at us, as I can remember. That was really hard for me to fly over that and not be able to land, but it was just a blessed trip. One of the things that I learned, that while the New Guineans are coming out of the jungle, they're dressing up, putting their clothes on, and acting like human beings, come back here to the United States, and we're going back into the jungle. We're taking our clothes off, acting like animals. I mean, I want to tell you, it struck me. It really did.
Amen.
When I came back and saw some of the things here and saw what I saw in Papua New Guinea. And so, boy, we need to be praying for our country. Well, then from there we went to Sydney, Australia. And Brother Scarborough also had a missionary in Sydney that he was well acquainted with. And so we went to Sydney, Australia, and spent a couple of weeks there. And so we spent a total of 28 days together. And Rick Scarborough snored real loud. So one night I recorded his snoring and played it back to him the next day. But we had a lot of fun together. It was a real blessing, and God used that trip as well in Rick Scarborough's life. I don't think he had ever taken a mission trip prior to that time. And he took several after that. And one of the purposes of the Wings as Eagles ministry in taking the trips is to burden the hearts of pastors for missions. Back then, I don't know what the figure is today, and I'm not sure we even knew for sure back then, but I was told that probably 80 or 85% of our preachers in independent Baptist churches had never been on a mission trip. And so our goal became, instead of hauling scriptures, getting pastors and their people to go on short mission trips. And we knew that once they went and experienced a time with the missionary on the field, they would see to it the scriptures got there. So our emphasis became taking people, though we also always take some scriptures, but our emphasis is taking the people, because God will burden hearts, and he'll see things happen. One of the things we've seen is reverse deputation. You take a pastor down to spend some time with a missionary on the field, and he ends up taking that missionary on for support. And, that it's just been a tremendous blessing in that way as well. Or seeing needs on the field and deciding, he needs this piece of property or whatever it is. He gets back home and ends up sending him some money to be able to make that purchase. And so God has just used the Wings ministry in many ways that I didn't even anticipate or dream of in the beginning.
What happened to Warren Plank after he went on that mission trip?
Warren Clank pastored probably for another 6 months or a year, and this is really kind of funny, because he was so moved with that mission trip that he preached nothing but Mexico in his pulpit for the next 6 months. And his head deacon told me one time, he said, if I hear him preach another message on Mexico, he said, I'm going to puke. He ultimately resigned his pastorate and ended up on the mission field in Mexico, where he serves today. In fact, we have a mission trip coming up in October, isn't it, Terry? Going to Cuauhtemoc, Mexico, where Warren Clank still serves down there as a missionary. Loves it. I mean, he has just been blessed, been used of God in such a wonderful way. And so that mission trip moved that pastor to where he really wanted it.
One thing that I've always wanted to know was, how did the song that we sing before prayer come about?
That song we heard from a missionary or an evangelist, I think. And I think it was an evangelist that came through.
Carlos Demarest.
No. I taught that to Carlos Demarest.
Okay.
Yeah. And I picked it up from that evangelist. And then I taught it to Carlos. Carlos must have heard me sing it sometime or something. And he picked it up, and he used to sing it in restaurants and terminal buildings and every place. And in fact, there were 2 or 3 times we would fly in commercially into El Paso, where Carlos Demarest was. And he would meet us at the gate, and we would sing that song before we left the gate. And we've had people stand there and clap, and it's been kind of an exciting thing. And so anyway, we adopted it as our Wings theme song, I guess. And God has used it and blessed it. In fact, weren't we at a restaurant down here one time? We sang the song here in town. There was a guy that did not like it a little bit. And he walked over to our table while we were singing it. He didn't interrupt it. But when we quit, he kind of let us know what he thought of it. Were you there, Terry? Yeah.
And then I recall after he left, a little old lady came up to the table and she said, "He doesn't like it, but the rest of us do. Keep singing it."
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. So we'd had some fun experiences singing that song. It's just been a real blessing, I think, for many years.
You tell the story of how Juanita helped you navigate.
You want me to tell that one?
I do.
Oh, boy. Well, I met this girl named Juanita Jenner, and I asked her for a date, and she consented when I offered her an airplane ride. She had never been in an airplane ride before. So our first date was in an airplane. Well, her folks attended a Lutheran church there in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis. And so I picked her up on I guess it must have been a Sunday afternoon, and rented this Aranca Champ. And we flew, and she was really familiar with the area. We were able to find that picnic out west of town. Now in Minneapolis, a large city, of course, back then, the tallest building in town was called the Fauché Tower. It was about 404 feet high, and stood high above everything else. And it was a beautiful, clear day. And we flew and found the picnic, and I circled it several times and waved my wings, and kind of showed off a little bit, and decided it was time to go back. Now, a champ is like the one sitting at the lift there at the hangar. So the passengers in back, the pilot's in the front. And so I roll out on a heading that I figure is going to take us back to where we came from. And I flew for a few minutes, and I thought, no, wait a minute. I ought to be seeing the Fauché Tower in Minneapolis, and I'm not seeing either one of them. So I looked at my compass, the first time I looked at the compass, and it said west. I thought, we can't be going west, we're going east. But I made a 180, and sure enough, back on the horizon is the Fauché Tower and Minneapolis. But now, I don't know if any of you guys have ever had this happen, but when you get turned around like that, now in my head, east is west, and west is east, and north is south, and south is north, and you're messed up. So I get back in on the outskirts of Minneapolis, and I turn around and I said, "Juanita, do you recognize anything out here?" And she said, "Yeah." She said, "This is Miracle Mile." And she said, "I just live right over here." I said, "Oh, good." I said, "Where do you think the airport would be from here?" So she said, "Oh, the airport would be up this way." I said, "Oh, thanks." So I make a turn, and once I made the turn and headed for the airport, then everything up here spun around and it was back to normal. But, I want to tell you, it was backwards for me there for a little bit. And so she salvaged our date that day. But I've used that You know, when you're lost and on your way to a burning hell, you've got to make a 180, or you're going to continue down that same path. Now, if I had just ignored everything and kept flying, eventually we'd have had to land someplace and run out of gas or whatever. But I had to decide that making that 180, repenting of where I was going, and making that 180 was going to make the difference. And it did. It salvaged our date, and 60 years later, here we are. So that's the story of being lost.
Man.
Now, I don't know how much more time we've got here. Okay. You want me to tell them about the lost key?
I was just thinking about that. I was going to ask you, but I don't know if I wanted you to put.
Sure. We were on a trip to, what was the name of the town?
We were in Calvillo.
You're right, Calvillo, Mexico. And Terry was flying by that time. And but we have two sets of keys. Terry carries one, and either Bart or I, if we were along, carried the other set. And so when we got in that night in the Calvillo, why, I handed Bart the key. And so I was relieved of that. And so at the end of the week, why, we get ready to go, and Terry wants to know where the other set of keys is. And I said, well, Bart's got them. He said, no, I don't. I said, yes, you do. And he said, no, I don't. I said, yes, you do. I said, when we got in here, I gave them to you. And he said, you didn't give them to me. And I said, Bart, I did give them to you. And so we're arguing about this. We got a 50-mile drive back to the main airport where we landed. So we're arguing about this, and I've got him convinced that he has lost the keys. And so I get back home, and I start digging through my luggage, and there's the key. I want to tell you, calling Bart and letting him know I had that key was one of the hardest phone calls I've ever made. I told him, I said, when you get home and discover that key, I said, you're going to really feel stupid. Oh, man. Then, of course, one time Bart was with me, and we were cruising along, going to Laredo, Texas, with the plans of going to Durango, Mexico, the next day. And we had refueled in someplace. What was it? Mineral Wells, you're right. Mineral Wells, Texas. So we had a full load of fuel, a full load of people, and we're cruising along in some rain, not really heavy rain, but it was raining. And I'm reading a chart, and Bart's of course it's on autopilot, but he's kind of watching things. And all of a sudden, the left engine starts acting up. And boy, it's going, wow, wow, just really way out of sync. And of course, I dropped the chart real quick and started paying attention to what's going on. And I noticed that the number 5 cylinder on the left engine is dead. And so we tried to, move the throttle levers and get them so that it settled down pretty well, and it was running relatively smoothly. And I was going to try to continue to take it on into Laredo. But in watching the oil temperature and pressures and that sort of thing, I saw both the oil temperatures starting to go up and the oil pressure coming down. There was no way we were going to continue. We were going to have to feather that left engine. So I feathered it, and we were at, I think, 6,000 feet at the time. And got a hold of Center, let them know our issue. We were going to have to divert to San Antonio. And so he gave us a clearance. We headed for San Antonio on one engine, and he gave us a clearance to descend to 4,000, which I probably at that time should not have accepted that clearance simply because we needed the altitude to our advantage. But I did. I went ahead and descended to 6,000 or to 4,000, And then we punched, thankfully we had a GPS at that time. Of course, we're solid gauges. And punched the GPS to the nearest airport. And when the nearest airport popped up, it was Johnson City, Texas. And Lyndon Bain Johnson Private Airport. But it showed a 6,000-foot paved runway, but no approach facilities. And so I knew that at any airport, there's a clearway area. There's a certain distance from the airport before you're going to be running into high towers or anything of that nature. So I crossed over the middle of the airport, looking at the GPS, told Bart to, be looking out the window. As soon as you see anything, you let me know. So I made one turn, come around. The second turn across the airport, he spotted it. He said, I see it. And so I'm in a right turn. So I continued the letdown, and we ended up breaking out of the clouds at about 300 feet and turned final approach there and landed on one engine, and of course kept the thing rolling so that we could get to the other end of the runway, and got to the northwest end of the runway, pulled off in a parking area there where there were a couple of hangars, and parked. And I turned around and told the preacher that was on board, I said, I want you to thank God for a safe landing. And so he prayed and thanked the Lord for safety. And then, of course, we needed to report where we were. And so I couldn't get a hold of anybody on the ground, but there was an overflight, some airline, and I called him and told him what had taken place. Would you report to San Antonio Approach Control that we're on the ground safely? So he did that, and he came back and said that they got it and said, good job, or something like that. Well, about that time, a green van pulls up, and this guy gets out in uniform, and he comes out and wants to talk to the captain. And so I talked to him, and he said, do you have any idea where you are? And I said, yeah, I'm in Johnson City, Texas. And he said, you are on the LBJ private ranch. And I thought, oh, my aching back. We're going to have Secret Service, the FBI, we're going to have everybody after us. And so anyway, he said, why don't you load up in our van here? And he said, I'll take you up to headquarters. And he said, we got some people who don't want to talk to you. So we loaded up, went up there, and the sheriff came out, and I forget who else, I guess the head of the park there, and went through, identifying ourselves and showing ID and all that kind of stuff. And afterwards, when it was all done, they said, well, what would you like to do now? And I said, well, I suppose we better find a hotel someplace. And it was getting about 4 or 5 in the afternoon. And we'll stay here for the night and try to make a decision of what to do tomorrow. And he said, okay. He said, load up in the van. I'll give you a little tour of the LBJ Ranch. So we did that, and a nice tour. The guys just treated us real well. And then we drove into Johnson City, Texas, and took us to the Saved Inn, the only hotel in town, I think. The Saved Inn. That was an appropriate name. So anyway, we check in there and got a hold of Bill Waldrop, who we were going to be staying with in Laredo. And I knew he had a 15-passenger van, which was relatively new, and asked him if it would be possible for him to come up and pick our crew up and finish the trip with them, taking the van, driving down instead of flying. And he said, yeah. He said, whatever it takes. And Bill's attitude, he was always there just to do whatever he could to help you. So he and another guy get in that van, and they drive up there that night. And we had them stay overnight. They loaded up the next morning, had breakfast, loaded up the next morning, and headed out. And left Bart and I back to take care of the airplane. Well, Bart and I were kind of looking for a rent-a-car because the airport was, 5 miles out of town or something like that. And asked at the restaurant if they knew where we could rent a car. I said, no, there's no place to rent a car in this town. And so there was a used car lot across the street. And so we thought, well, maybe we can pick something up there. So we walked across there, and it was unmanned lot. If you were interested, you filled out a note, stuck it in the thing, and they'd get a hold of you. That kind of a thing. So we were stuck there. So then there was kind of a quick trip or something about a block or two down the street. So we walked down there, and it's a little Mexican girl standing behind the counter, and she says, "Can I help you?" And I says, "Muy problema," and speaking a little Spanish to her. And then she started speaking Spanish to me, but I had just exhausted mine. So I told her, I said, what had happened the night before. And I said, do you have any idea where we might be able to borrow or rent a vehicle to be able to get out to the airport? She said, sure. She reached over, grabbed a set of keys, and said, here, you can use mine. And it was a relatively new pickup sitting out front. And I said, really? I said, you don't know us from Adam. She said, that's all right. She said, you'll be back. And so she loaned us her vehicle. And we went out, remember, we went out and got in the truck, and her purse was in there. And so being the good Christians we were, we opened it up to see if there was any cash first. And no, I took the purse back into her, and I said, hey, you left your purse in the truck. I said, I'm sure you want that. She said, oh, yeah, thank you. And so I talked to her for just a little bit again, and I said, by the way, when do you need us back here? And she said, well, I pick up my kids from school at about 3 p.m, so she'd like it back by 3. And I said, we'll have it back by 3. And as we were walking out the door, she said, oh, by the way, she said, don't bother putting any gas in it. She said, I get gas free here. And so we took the truck and went out to the airport and talked to the head ranger out there and about what had taken place the day before, and wanted to know if you had any idea where we could find an NP mechanic that could come and take a look at the airplane and determine what kind of a situation we had. Is it going to be an engine change, something we can fix? What is it? And so he said, yeah. He said, about 12 miles down the road is Frederick, I think it was, Texas. And he said, I said, I'll tell you what. He said, I don't have anything going on at the moment. He said, I'll take you over there. And he said, take you to where you can find a mechanic. So we left the truck there and jumped in with him, and he took us over there. We found the mechanic, and he was going to lunch within about an hour. I said, well, why don't you let us take you to lunch? And afterwards, then, if you could go back and take a look at the airplane for us, why, we'd sure appreciate that. Yeah, he said, we can do that. So we did. We took him out to lunch and then went back to the LBJ ranch, and he'd looked at things, and sure enough, one of the valves had dropped into the cylinder and destroyed number 5 cylinder, and of course put metal all through the engine. So it was going to be an engine change. We weren't going anywhere. And I don't know how much more of this story you want to hear, but it's just amazing to me how God worked out every detail. LBJ had a grandson. Yeah, I think it was his grandson.
Lyndon, wasn't it?
Lyndon Nugent.
You're right, Lyndon Nugent. Isn't that his grandson? Mm-hmm. A high-powered attorney out of San Antonio. And I was put in touch with him, and he asked, what we wanted to do. He said, I heard about your problem. And he said, what would you like to do? And I said, well, we're going to have to leave it here until we can get an engine and get it replaced. And he said, would you like to hangar it? And I said, well, do you have a hangar we can put it in? He said, yeah. He said, we sure do. And boy, I tell you, these guys, they just treated us royally, took care of us. One of the fellows that helped us was a guy that had flown for LBJ, and he was kind of in charge of the hangars there. And this guy had flown for 5 different presidents, and just helped us, did everything he could to be a blessing. Terry ultimately come down and helped us replace the engine and get it going. John Douglas, who is going to be flying the Sportsman across to Cameroon, of course, had a big part in seeing that project taken care of. But God has just watched over us and taken care of us and supplied again in ways that just leaves me in awe at the great God we have.
Amen.
If God leads you to do something, go. Not fearing, trusting Him. If you know you're doing what He wants you to do, He'll provide. He'll take care of you. And He's proven it to us for 33 years. And I just can't praise Him enough. Any more? Okay, Sam says that's good enough. We're done. Well, thank you once again. Lord bless you and enjoy the rest of your week.
Amen. Thank you.